Hello and welcome to The Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. And today, we're going to go swimming in a big old pool of free speech with one of my very favorite thinkers on the subject, Greg Lukianoff. It's a fun chat. It's a smart chat. I even run some hypotheticals of, can I get arrested if I say X at him? Enjoy! Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and along with Nadine Strossen, is the author of The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. Welcome back, Greg Lukianoff.
Hey, Andrew, how are you?
I'm well. Greg, you're one of my favorite guests. I like that you keep publishing books because our friendship consists of you writing books and me interviewing you about them, but I'm fine with that.
This one was so much less painful than a normal book. By the way, I am proudly drinking a Red Bull. I feel like on your show I can kind of relax a little bit.
Myself. I mean, you can drink whiskey if you'd like. Whatever you'd like. We're recording at about 11 a.m. I feel like Red Bull is very appropriate.
And Red Bull and whiskey doesn't go right. I mean, a vodka Red Bull is more of the classic.
There you go. Yeah, that'd work okay.
Exactly.
Well, here's what I want to do. I agree with everything in your book. I'm very much with you on free speech, and I'm very much with you in the arguments that you proffer along with Nadine in your book. So I want to steelman you the best arguments I can against our position and see if some elucidation can't come out of that. Okay. So you're very much a free speech advocate. It's what you've done with your career. You're the free speech guy. Me steelmanning this. Everybody's pro free speech. Everybody I know is pro free speech on this continent and in Europe, and they all have exceptions. I'm very pro free speech, but for this thing. But that would include you and me too, where it's I'm very pro free speech. Okay, that person.
But I do want to disagree, even right on the outset.
Ooh, okay, spicy.
It used to be the case that everybody in the United States, or almost everybody in the United States, would say, "I'm pro free speech," but one thing that I saw coming early in my career was the sort of utopian social justice, critical studies kind of idea that actually free speech itself is a problem.
Okay.
And that because it's typical and expected if you're a First Amendment lawyer or a free speech advocate to hear the argument that essentially I believe in free speech, but here are my exceptions. And I always point out, by the way, there are exceptions even under the First Amendment. They just have certain rules around them that make them minimally, in my opinion, harmful to actual free speech. But the idea of being philosophically opposed to freedom of speech as a neutral principle is increasingly popular among our, and forgive me for sounding like a Marxist, ruling elite, because this is a popular idea in academia. And I've been sounding the alarm about this. But there are many more books coming out lately that are not free speech is good, but we should limit it to these conditions, to more like free speech is bad, academic freedom's good, but it has nothing to do with freedom of speech. Our special protection, that one's the good one, but you miscreants, you shouldn't have. You get what we give you.
Okay, in that line of inquiry, what is the difference between freedom of speech and academic freedom?
Freedom of speech. Now, I have a vision of freedom of speech where I tend to think of it as like the big Boolean sphere, like the big circle around which smaller concepts like Jonathan Rauch's idea of liberal science is included. And liberal science is the idea that when you're in a truth-seeking argument, and that's honestly not most of the time. Most of the time you're saying, I hate the Rockford Files. I mean, nobody hates the Rockford Files. But like a good
relevant reference, Greg. Please continue.
Absolutely. Everybody should watch the Rockford Files.
Yeah.
Man. Jim Garner is best. But is he ever at his worst? Anyway. That essentially, like within that sphere, you have ideas like liberal science, and liberal science is more or less the idea that no argument is ever truly over, and that nobody gets to call special authority to end an argument. And I think those are basically the rules of how we figure out what's true in society today. I think of academic freedom as something that fits within the sphere of liberal science, where essentially academic freedom is it's and it's partially overlapping with freedom of speech, but it's within the sphere of freedom of speech. And academic freedom is the ability for an institution to decide what is taught, for professors to decide how it shall be taught, and for students to be able to dissent against that and not be punished for dissenting against it if they can defend their arguments, and for them to have a right to follow their research where it goes. The professors have that right as well. I left one out of that. The traditional argument is departmental academic freedom. The departments decide to decide who gets promoted, who gets hired, all of this stuff. And while I still believe in departmental academic freedom, I've also been probably the most jaded by it. That essentially I do feel like the place where a lot of universities have really fallen down is at the departmental level, where they just sort of replicate people who agree with them. And I think that's been really toxic to the marketplace of ideas higher education is supposed to be.
I don't remember the specifics on this, but a couple of years ago, I want to say the state of Florida just started cutting specific professorships or specific topics from its public schools. So things that have equity in them, or a lot of things that have studies in them. Would that be a abrogation of academic freedom by virtue of the legislature coming in? Would you be opposed to that?
Yeah, I mean, can a university decide that we're getting rid of entire majors or entire departments? Yes, they can actually decide that. Do I like that being decided by fiat by government? Of course I don't. Now, of course, if something is a government school, does the government have more say-so in it? Then yes. But still, there's all sorts of complications in that. But what isn't hard at all, it was the Stop Woke Act, which happened in Florida. This was something that was really championed by Chris Rufo and Governor DeSantis. And it specifically banned the discussion of particular topics in class, and not just topics, but advocating on behalf of certain ideas. And they tried to argue that somehow made that more constitutional, like more likely to. And when lawyers were asked to kind of flesh this out, they were put in this wonderfully horrible position of having to make the argument with a straight face that under this law, yes, a professor would be perfectly fine arguing against affirmative action in their class, but they couldn't argue for it. And it's like, okay, you're admitting that this singles out individual viewpoints as being ones that can be banned by the state. That makes it laughably unconstitutional. And we told them that it was going to be laughably unconstitutional before it passed. We warned them not to pass it. They passed it. We sued. We won. It's now on appeal. But if this makes it up to the Supreme Court, for example, I'm very confident that the Stop Woke Act will once again lose. It's not a close call.
I'm in agreement with you. That very much seems like it's trying to use the power of the state, or at least the power of the purse, to restrict opinion and speech and try to dictate, which I'm fundamentally against. I have more latitude for the state coming in and adjusting resource allocation in terms of majors. I don't like it either, but I do kind of see a point where I think academia can produce these sort of theological sinecures. They wouldn't call it theological, but I would straight up call it theological.
Sure.
And when they're sort of replicating Byzantine level. God, I swear to God, I'm not a right-wing radio host who's on back painkillers right now. But when they're sort of creating wokery in more and more Rococo formations, I'm like, there might need to be pruning at some point.
Byzantine and Rococo?
Right? I know, right? That's not something you'd hear Rush Limbaugh say. But I don't really like it. I can kind of see the need for coming in and going, all right, this is a public university. It does need to have a certain amount of advantageous knowledge that's being distributed to students. Therefore, we're going to cut down on things that we think are extraneous, as opposed to what you mentioned earlier of we're basically saying you as a professor have to adopt the party line, and that does very much bother me.
Yeah, I do actually think that for example, if the state were to come in and say, University of Florida is a technological school now. Do I think the state government be able to do that? Probably, yeah. They probably could. But what they can't do is, say that exactly like this professor can't teach that, and that's never okay.
You are an English professor, and you are forbidden.
I am?
Yes, you bad news. You got drafted. Yeah. Okay. Well, hold on. I want to back up though because I don't want to lose the thread on this. So my earlier Steelman argument that I was playing around with is myself and most people I know would say we are robust free speech advocates. And if someone were to come to me and go, well, what if somebody says a falsifiable statement about somebody in order to try to ruin their career? I'd go, well, that's not free speech. That's libel. I'm not for libel.
It could
right?
be. It depends.
So it could be. But so like I have, or you know, like what about we're at the bar and somebody says, let's all go home and murder that guy. I go, well, no, that's not really free speech. So I do think that there's a certain amount of being able to cookie cutter the definition to suit whatever I or people like me want to be defined as free speech. So that's part A. But it also sounds like what you're indicating is that there's at least a commitment to the concept of free speech, and we're kind of quibbling around the edges. But what you're seeing more of is people that have they don't even care about the basic premise of free speech is good.
Yeah. Well, everybody, even the worst totalitarian, believes that they should have freedom of speech.
Right, yes.
And they believe Lenin believed in free speech for Leninists, but not for anybody else. The Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse believed in freedom of speech for the left, but not for the right. And he was very direct about it. This guy still gets talked about like he's a genius by people who should know better. And it's like, wow, he's making an argument for old-fashioned authoritarianism. Congratulations, dude, for discovering that. And when it comes to the exceptions to freedom of speech, I think that the American First Amendment jurisprudence is special because I think it is the longest meditation by some of the brightest minds in the United States to figure out how to have freedom of speech in the world as it actually is. And the exceptions that they've come up with don't deviate from this point. And sometimes people try to compliment me by calling me a free speech absolutist. And I'm like, that's actually not so much a thing. There are people who call themselves that, but they usually they're not. They don't think anything that you do with words is protected. Like your money or your life is done with words, but depending on the context, that's very illegal. But what I call myself is an opinion absolutist.
Okay.
That essentially you should be allowed that there's a reason for protecting anybody's opinion as expressed. And when you look at the exceptions to freedom of speech under the First Amendment, they're never about what your opinion is.
You're never penalized for thought. You're never penalized for thinking. You're never punished for thinking. You're punished for the expression thereof or something that is...
something that starts to look more like one of the most common themes in the exception of free speech is something that starts to look a lot more like crossing that line into your money or your life.
Right.
Where we're just like,
threat.
okay, I'm sorry, you used words to stick somebody up, but so
right.
what? Is kind of the attitude about that. But like incitement, like an incitement is not, I think someone should kill the president. It's I'm going to go kill the president in a way that's like credible, that actually looks like, well, that's not incitement, but like a true threat, like essentially something that would place a reasonable person
If I got really mad at you, Greg, in this phone call, and I said your address and where your kids were, and so everybody, we got to go kill Greg because ... That's different than I disagree with Greg.
Yeah, and that's more like incitement, but saying that like I'm gonna kill you if, for example, that's blackmail, that's that's a true threat, that's all of this kind of stuff that isn't protected. But that starts to look a lot more like using words in a pattern of behavior, as opposed to merely saying I think offensive thing X. And I think that relates back to the bedrock principle of First Amendment law that you can't ban something simply because it's offensive.
Okay. That's well put. I'm going to steal that from you. I'm
smarter than I look.
Yeah.
I would have to be, frankly.
That Red Bull's kicking in, Greg. Thank God.
I'd forget how to breathe.
Yeah. Okay. I too am an opinion absolutist, and share your commitment to the idea that people should not be penalized for holding an opinion. I am very reticent to curb speech at all, but I will acknowledge there are certain things. They're usually couched in an imminent threat, or something that is going past expressing a belief to trying to bodily or through duplicity reputationally harm someone. But they're exceptions. They're targeted and also subject to the many, many, many rubrics that have been hammered out by the Supreme Court over time. So, okay, that makes me feel better. I'm not being a hypocrite. It's not that I'm free speech for me, none for thee. How about this? In the kickoff to your book, in the introduction, your introducer says that there are two great threats to speech in the West, that speech should be subordinated.
Jacob Mishingama, a FIRE senior fellow and a great First Amendment free speech advocate in his own right. His book, Free Speech, from Socrates to Social Media, is excellent. I highly recommend it.
You referenced that in the book several times. It didn't click with me that that's the same author. Oh, great.
Okay. I think like people see my last name and get a little intimidated, but people see Jacob's last name and and it's Mishingama.
Okay, Jacob Mishingama. Well, in the introduction, he says that there's two principal threats to freedom of speech in the West, that the belief that there is no threat to freedom of speech, and secondary, that speech should be subordinated to other priorities like order, security, tolerance. We've already kind of talked about that a little bit. In terms of the threat to free speech, how significant is that threat? How worried are you?
I'm extremely worried. I'm particularly extremely worried by the fact that the rest of the so-called free world is turning on freedom of speech, and that there are different estimates on how many people are arrested every day in England, for example, in Britain, where my mom grew up, where I spent a lot of time in my kidhood. Mm-hmm. And one of the estimates is around 30 people a day. I think that was in The Economist. But there have been quibbles, and I think like one of them said, well, it's more like 7 people a day. I'm like,
only 7.
Oh, wow, that's it.
Who are arrested for an opinion.
So that's for offense speech, which is offensive comments on the internet, which is like, well, what do you think the internet is for? But a lot of times these are people complaining about immigration, for example, and immediately in the U.S., people who are sympathetic to this are like, well, that's hate speech, and it's kind of like complaining about immigration policy is core political speech, and you can't actually cut down on that without fundamentally, undermining your democracy. But in Germany, like for example. And people always like, oh, but Germany has a totalitarian past, and they give them a pass. And I'm like, so that means you should get back to doing totalitarianism just from a different direction?
Well, as you point out in the book, Greg, and I really loved this, you make an excellent empirical analysis. I think a lot of the time when we're talking about free speech, we start from first principles and the values that we hold as a liberal society, all of which I agree with. You go into the empirical side and go, in Germany's case, they had restrictions on what you could say in terms of racism right before Hitler came in. Like they already had that law, and it failed to stop Hitler from coming in. Meanwhile, in the United States, we relaxed our hate speech laws 60 years ago, or in 1960. I guess it's about the same thing. And we've had a lot better racial relations since that time. Jim Crow has ended since that time. So in our case, we have looser speech laws in the United States, and that's correlated with better civil rights and race relations. Meanwhile, it didn't stop Hitler from rising. So there's an argument to be made that they're uncorrelated or negatively correlated.
Well, I go further than even Nadine, and I say that essentially that one actually makes the other problem worse. And that's because of group polarization. Yeah. Group polarization is a phenomenon that if you talk to people that so if you take a dozen people, you figure out where they are politically, and you break them into 2 groups of 6 and send them off to talk about hot-button political issues that they agree on, they're going to come back more radicalized in the direction of the group, like pretty much without fail. They're going to be like, MAGA, like defund the police, like as loud as they can. That's an exaggeration, people. But anyway, but they're going to come.
But if you and I were opposed to immigration, and it's just the 2 of us, and we go have a conversation, or us and 5 other people have a conversation about immigration. We're all immigration skeptics. We will reinforce that core position and leave
everybody ends up going, you don't go far enough. Yeah. You are so right.
Or alternately, if we're in favor of immigration and we're all with other pro-immigration people, we end up becoming open borders or closer to it because we don't have anybody pointing out.
You don't go far enough.
Yeah, exactly.
every right-thinking person agrees on this. And that's a very natural phenomenon of group polarization. And the best cure for group polarization is having dissenters in the group, basically having someone saying, wait a second, hold on, really? And what happens when you actually have a censorship regime is that you don't change anyone's mind, obviously. Nobody goes like, the government says I can't think this anymore, so I guess I won't.
Mike Johnson said I'm not allowed to think this. So I guess I'm going to go along with the majority in Congress because they're doing such a bang-up job.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh yeah, no, I love government deciding for me what I can think. But they only talk to people that they know it's safe to talk to, which also means people they agree with. So that tends to make people more radicalized in the direction of the group. So the way I put it, and I'm going to name drop a little bit here on Bill Maher's show, was the rise in anti-Semitism in Western Europe, even though they've had laws against anti-Semitic speech in many of these countries since the 1990s. Anti-Semitism has skyrocketed. Now, of course, people point out that that's partially from that having a lot of immigration from the Muslim world has something to do with that. But I also make the point that when you have a policy that encourages people to only talk to other anti-Semites, you shouldn't be surprised that anti-Semitism really spikes. So I do actually think that these laws don't just they don't have a benefit. I think they have a sincere and serious harm in the form of group polarization, but also not understanding what people actually think is also a serious harm.
Yes, I'm with you on all of that, and I'm with you, by the way, on Europe and Britain. I spent a lot of time in Scotland. Scotland had a weird speech law come out last year, and I don't remember all of the ins and the outs of it. Didn't bother any of the Scots that I spoke to. Really bothered me because it was vague language. It was like if you feel that somebody has said something hateful to you, you can report them to the police. And the standard that the police had was something that a reasonable person would feel is inflammatory, or there were a lot of very vague words, and it was predicated on what I hear a lot, which seems to be the standard position for my European friends and my British friends, which is we're very in favor of freedom of speech, of course. And freedom of speech is very important. But, negative ideas that have harm, of course, should be censored from the general public. You can't have bad ideas spread if they're harmful. But no, we're in favor of speech, but for the bad ideas. And I'm like, I don't think you have speech then. Like freedom of speech exists to protect the unpopular, weird, crank ideas. That's why it's there.
Yeah, and most importantly, my mom's British, so usually when people do a British accent, I'm like, oh, God, you're terrible. You're pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I could do a pretty good, stodgy old Tory. I could do a pretty good Scotsman. When I do Cockney, it, weaves in and out of Australian, so I can't do that one too well. Every once in a while, I'll try a Northern accent, but I'm hit or miss.
Yeah, Cockney's hard, and I since I had a cute little British lilt as a kid, and I grew up in the greater New York area, you get that beat out of you. So I can't even fake a British accent. There's deep and abiding, no.
You've been Clockwork Oranged from your British accent.
Exactly. Although I joke a lot about this on Twitter. I do still have a little British superego, about politeness crises and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so to kind of go broader for a minute, you are concerned about the erosion of freedom of speech, particularly in Europe, but increasingly in the United States.
But also the achievement of a new level of totalitarianism in the already totalitarian countries. I think that what you've been able to do with a combination of surveillance and AI in Iran is dystopian, brings dystopian to a whole new level. I think what they're doing in China,
real smart about it. Yeah,
terrifying.
Let's all use one app that the government has a backdoor to, so they can run quantitative analysis and just snip out anything that's remotely problematic right from the get-go. And then if you further bother us, we're going to change your credit score so that you can't get groceries within outside of 10 miles of your house. So that you're basically
in Iran they can shut off your car.
Really?
If you don't if you're not wearing your hijab right. And they do this, essentially, they will get a picture of someone not wearing their hijab correctly, and turn off her car.
Well, okay, so I had you mentioned John Rauch in your book. I've had him on a couple of times on the show previously. In his book, The Constitution of Knowledge, he makes the case that very similar to what you're saying, that freedom of speech is an eternally radical doctrine because it is contravened.
The name of my Substack, in fact.
Yeah, and it's contravened to the instincts that we have, which is you are besmirching something sacred to me. You must be brought to heel. It cannot leave your lips. Alternately, this very tightly held belief I have that's very important. You have an opposite view. You're going to hurt people. We need to squelch you. I buy that. If that is the case, that people kind of instinctively want to squelch oppositional speech, why is it that it's changing now? And how did we get out of that? Why did America become exceptional in that regard? And why would it be changing?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I call my Substack the Eternally Radical Idea is because I really, when people ask whether or not free speech is liberal or conservative, first of all, that annoys the hell out of me because like we're so stupidly partisan that essentially someone will be like, well, if it's conservative, then it's not good, or if it's liberal, it's not good. Well, actually, sorry, it is liberal. It's just not progressive. A word that I really would like to bring out.
I have banished with the exception of earlier when I couldn't figure out how to say the radio thing. I very rarely say right wing or left wing anymore. I don't want to feed into that paradigm. And I'm also one of those holdouts that uses liberal in the old European sense, like I'm a liberal.
Do you say fascist and libtard?
I will occasionally say fascist, but I'm very specific in my usage thereof. Like I'm using it
actually,
very specifically.
Fascist actually means something. It is an argument that I actually I try to make. It's like a lot of times I'm kind of like, you're just describing authoritarianism. Good old fashioned horrible authoritarianism. But anyway, sorry, what was the question again?
Okay, I'm muddled through this, but assuming that kind of the default state for civilization is
how do we get here?
Suppress oppositional speech. If that is the case, what is changing now? Why would we be altering now?
We're falling back to the mean. We're regressing to the mean, essentially. That in human history, free speech is eternally radical. It's not very normal in history. So unless it's something you actively promote and fight for and teach as a discipline and a practice, it's going to erode pretty much flat out because it goes against human nature to a large degree. And I think that we also have something that I call problems of comfort. It's a term that I coined in my short book, Freedom from Speech, that essentially, and it's the way I sort of square the circle with me and people like Pinker. So like Pinker sometimes is presented as someone who just thinks everything's getting better and it's unavoidable, like as Nassim Taleb liked to besmirch him.
I'm more in that camp. I'm a congenital optimist. I think everything's going to be great except for the debt.
Yeah, but I always make the point that, and I thought Taleb, after calling Pinker a charlatan, he calls everyone a charlatan, was being so intellectually dishonest because he was then proceeded to present Pinker as if he's saying everything's automatically going to get better. And I'm like, I read every one of Pinker's books, and he's saying, no, we could blow this up. We could completely upend this progress through ideology. That bad ideology can undo human progress. And so we have to realize what we're doing right so we keep doing it, because right now we're not taking any credit for the stuff we're doing right. So that's a potential disaster right there. So I think he's like an anxious optimist, like in a lot of ways. And that's so I do believe that, if I had to choose any time to live, I would probably choose right now or 10 years from now, probably. Yeah. Just for everything from creature comforts to wealth to all that kind of stuff. But as things get more comfortable, as life gets easier, as you're able to increasingly surround yourself with people and media and now AI that tells you just you're so correct and just so very, very handsome, like all the time, that essentially we're progressing in exactly the way you'd predict us to progress, that we're moving towards difficulty, toward away from scarcity, towards abundance and comfort. But there are downsides to this, because there's downsides to everything. Everything is trade-offs. And if you're less comfortable with emotional pain, if you're less comfortable with the difficulty of interacting and disagreeing with people, you're going to be less comfortable with freedom of speech. So I think this is the kind of thing that is a problem of comfort, or sometimes, as John Haidt and I called it in the somewhat more politically correct way, problem of progress, that essentially there's a category of things that get worse precisely because other material things are getting better. So I believe that it's predictable that freedom of speech would be something that would suffer as society became more comfortable, because it's difficult. It's a nuisance. It's an unpleasant way to live. But there's also the issue of ideology, particularly on campus. And the ideology, that particularly is dominant in sort of social justice circles is very hostile to freedom of speech for people you disagree with. I mean, the entire idea of hate speech is essentially, a way of controlling speech that you hate.
All of that is fascinating. I'm going to have to ponder that idea that sort of, as we become more affluent, we become more emotionally delicate, and therefore freedom of speech is more repulsive to us. Is there a way for us to do comparative analysis on this? I don't know if there's an answer to this, but are there countries that have comparable positions on freedom of speech to us historically that are not as economically advanced as us? And if so, do they have more robust free speech? Like theoretically, I don't know this, but let's say Bolivia was like, yes, the U.S. Constitution's amazing. We're a free speech culture from now on. Free speech is really important. They're not as economically advanced. Are we seeing the same kind of atrophy in developing countries, or is it just in the affluent ones?
That would be a tough experiment to do, partially because you have threats from free speech coming from every possible direction. And one of them is a threat to free speech can be crime and disorder. That essentially, like if you have a place like El Salvador, where I think they hit something like so a lot of European countries have a murder rate of 1 per 100,000. And that's usually the way you measure it. America, sadly, we have something like 6 or 7 usually. DC, where I live, we have like 35.
Wait, you live in DC? I thought you were in New York.
No, I live in DC.
I live in Alexandria. Do you want to get lunch sometime?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe like a steak salad or something.
Sounds good to me. Yeah,
maybe a burrito, maybe Indian.
Yeah.
But San Salvador was like 120, which was insane. And when you have that kind of like clamp down on disorder, a lot of times that comes with speech restrictions as well, which is exactly what we're seeing in El Salvador at the moment. So I think that threats to freedom of speech can come from multiple different directions. Generally, affluence was tied to an increase in respect for freedom of speech. But I do think that I feel like in some ways, I wonder what the best comparison would be, for the problems of comfort kind of idea. You'd have to find a country that used to be good on free speech, got more broadly comfortable, and got less comfortable with freedom of speech. And I think that does describe a lot of countries in Europe. America, in its own weird way, though, is a affluent country that's not necessarily all that comfortable. It's a tougher, harder working, kind of more tumultuous place.
It's difficult. It would be difficult to do the governmental the intergovernmental comparison there anyway, because you're not going to have one-to-one speech laws in any country. Like most other countries, even if they have a comparable culture of free speech, aren't going to have the same constitutional order that we do, which would make it difficult to do quantitative analysis.
Well, and there's also a very important confound here. Now we're talking about confounds. I do actually think that this, and Britons resent me for saying this, but I just think they're wrong. That America doesn't have and really has never had a single idea of what it means to be an American. We've pretended to sometimes. We've had Uncle Sam and we've had Hulk Hogan, singing "I'm a real American," rest in peace. But at the same time, we've always been a country where nobody thinks that Richmond is anything like Portland, Maine, is anything like Atlanta, Georgia, is anything like the countryside of Virginia. Like we are a people who are very, very different from each other and always have been. We don't have an idea of what a modal American should be like, other than maybe know their pop culture references and be patriotic, historically. But when it comes to like a place like Britain, there is, and what you were describing when you were talking about that Scottish thing, when the Scots are defending it, they have an idea that a reasonable person is going to more or less agree on what's beyond the pale for offensiveness. We don't really have that as much. So like the idea that there's a John Bull, like a modal Brit, that is that can be described as an individual person with tastes and preferences and all that kind of stuff, which is a lie, which is an illusion, but it's a national myth. It can create this idea that, well, we all agree that this is beyond the pale. So you have an idea of a modal French person, a modal German person, a modal Brit, which allows this kind of excuse for the imposition of what are almost always upper class norms on everybody else.
That also makes a lot of sense. I think that kind of explains another element of my earlier question of why would America be exceptional. I would love to think that it's purely ideology, that we committed ourselves to freedom of speech early on.
It's our beautiful hearts and souls, Andrew.
But you're hinting towards a structural reason for that, which is our Overton window has always been larger. It's significantly larger. One of the conversations I regularly have with my European friends when they talk about how it's crazy that we don't do X that they do. I will point out that there are scaling matters, that Norway's 3.5 million people as opposed to the United States, which is 370 million people.
Yes.
But beyond that, like there's really, from what I can tell, the idea of what ought government do, the latitude's pretty narrow in every European country compared to the United States. The range of opinions of how should political economy be run is much more median bell curve distribution in all of those countries. And if you're going to have a country that is more ethnically homogenous, more ideologically homogenous, more religiously homogenous, then you're not going to require as much pluralism in order to stop things from going off the rails. Whereas in some places, ideologically, religiously, ethnically diverse as the United States, you have to have pluralism or you have civil war. And so maybe that's why we've been so big on free speech.
Yeah, no, it's our genuine, and sometimes I just call it deep pluralism, and sometimes I just add the deep to basically like really emphasize, no, I really mean it. Like we are a wonderfully diverse country where our regions are very different from each other, all of these things. But yeah, and it is actually funny that you started with the overall population of the United States, because I used to live in the Czech Republic. And I would have the recurrent conversation with like a Czech kid, and the Czech Republic, I think, is about 10 million people. Hopefully I didn't get that way off. And they'd always ask me what Americans are like. And my first response is like, well, first of all, there are 330 million of us. And some of us are from Lebanon, and some of us are from Bangkok. Like it's – and I'm a first-generation kid who grew up in an immigrant neighborhood. And like that's what I really love about America is that we are this wondrous cacophony. But I will say something that will also probably appeal to your libertarianism, and I've been saying this a lot more often because I'm a big fan of Francis Fukuyama, because I think he's brilliant, and I love his books, and I think his idea that essentially one of the great forces you have to fight historically is repatrimonialization. Way too long of a word, but like the idea that sort of like the ruling elite, essentially. You end up having, the idea of elite overproduction, but they essentially don't want to give up power, and that's when you get really sort of like really sort of destabilized. So I love a lot of what Fukuyama has to say, but he does puzzle a lot over the United States. And the thing that I think I do think that in some ways America has a lot of the same problems as the rest of the world, and we can learn a lot from how they handle it. But one thing that we have that is different is a libertarian core to the United States, that if we lose it, then we become just like everybody else in the worst possible sense. And this is not just me complimenting libertarians. And to get back to Steve Pinker likes to point out there's never been a libertarian country, like all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, but it's a goal to work towards that. Essentially, the magic of sometimes defaulting on more freedom, not less, is that doing less in a lot of cases, having less top down, actually has led to some of the best results in human history. And this is something that doesn't sit well with a certain kind of mindset. The idea of liberal institutions being ones that don't truly have a single person or a small group of people who are totally in charge doesn't sit well with people who think they should be the philosopher kings.
Well, so with that particular group, or in general, you've stated that you're worried about the future of free speech in our country and elsewhere. I'm curious, during your tenure at Fire, how long have you been at Fire now?
862 years.
That's what I thought. Yeah, about 862 years. Yeah, one Methuselah.
23 years, actually.
23. Okay, so that's a really good amount of time, right? You've almost been there for an entire generation of people. Are the arguments that you're hearing opposed to free speech what we talked about earlier of the, free speech is bad in and of itself? It's not that we're for free speech, but we have exceptions. But free speech is the power, it's the power of the majority, or it's white, or whatever the thing is. Are the arguments the same and repeated year by year? Have they mutated? Are they going in a particular direction? Have you noticed changes in the intellectual currents of people that are opposed to free speech?
The arguments, I would say the kind of like a newish argument over the last 10 years, well, at the start of my career, the big threat was hate speech, shouldn't be protected. And then, of course, it's defined as and that's what decimated freedom of speech on campus, was basically this loose, amorphous idea of offensive speech should not be tolerated. And it works out exactly the way you would expect it to, that essentially things that are considered locally offensive in a highly biased place ends up being basically political speech that they don't like. So that was the new-ish threat when I started my career, or actually even when I was in law school, and even that had been around for a while. Then I'd say one of the more interesting innovations in the censorship space was misinformation. And Biden was really big on this. Misinformation, disinformation, the most odious one of all is malinformation. Do you know what malinformation is?
No, I don't. What is malinformation?
Malinformation is when you say something that is true but deceptive.
I do that all the time. Yeah.
Like
whenever
if you give
anybody
a story,
says I need to talk to you, I'm like, time to rev up my malinformation. This is going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, that essentially, like, if you tell a story about a girl who was raped, for example, and the response is, well, that's not representative of how that usually goes. It's like, okay, are you suggesting that story should be suppressed? Like what? Of course, immediately from someone like me, followed by, what is wrong with you? But misinformation is the whole ball game. Like, essentially, like, if government gets to decide what is true, we're all doomed. Like that, and that's one of the reasons why AI regulation scares me so much. Is power can't decide what reality looks like, or that's 1984 almost by definition. Now, I will give some credit here, and it's not the best kind of credit that you want to be given. Is the Trump administration has been very creative in the way it goes after freedom of speech, and usually you get a little bit kind of like used to certain kinds of pitches, more or less, from from people who are trying to restrict freedom of speech. Where you're just kind of like, okay, there's like 24 or so arguments, like that people say this can be restricted for this reason: hate speech, misinformation, whatever. But the Trump administration for the last 6 months, we'll have our morning meeting, and we're kind of like, can they do that? Like in a way that we're not used to having that many kind of like novel sort of like censorship theories. I will say, if I was going to add an argument to the War on Words, available in fine bookstores somewhere, it would be now, because I'm sick of having this argument, the government can remove federal funding from, say, like, I'm having this debate right now on X. The president of a school board somewhere, of a public school board, said, I'm glad Hulk Hogan died. And of course, I don't like that. He was he was a big part of my kidhood in the 1980s. He's a goofy patriot dude. And the fact that he's pro-Trump, that's his right.
Also, just in general, I don't like to take joy in the death of others. Like, whenever I'm happy somebody died, I'm kind of like, is this who I want to be?
Yeah, I'll be happy when Putin dies, and that's probably about it.
Yeah. And I do watch the death of Stalin when I get depressed. That's That's what I watch to cheer myself up. So I do have a touch of it.
That guy can go to hell.
Yeah.
But other than that, I don't like people cheering people's death. But at the same time, do you have the right to say that? Like, basically, this person was like, well, he's a MAGA supporter. Good riddance. But now, like, there's a politician who's basically saying, well, we're going to pull your federal funding for the school district. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. That is direct punishment also to a school district because of something the board chair had every right in the world to say as a private citizen. And now I'm getting all of these sudden First Amendment experts on the Twitters, being kind of like, well, they don't have a right to federal funding. It's like, you can't remove federal funding from something because you don't like the protected speech of someone vaguely involved or in some way involved with it. That's ridiculous. So I would add that argument. I would make that the 11th argument in War on Words.
What would a substantial, like moving forward, not where we are right now, but worse, what would a substantial and realistic erosion of free speech look like in the United States? If it goes down a bad but likely route, what would it look like 10, 20 years from now?
Oh, wow. I'm curious to see what happens with this Supreme Court. I wasn't surprised that they said age verification for porn could now be required. I saw that one coming, a while away. What I am scared of, and some people could actually partially blame, me and Jonathan Haidt for this, is the idea that the internet becomes a place that you have to identify who you are in order to essentially use it. That's one of the reasons why, and I've been very clear about, as much as I genuinely love John, and I agree. Like I'd like kids to be off social media and off phones as much as possible. I support no phones in schools, and there's no First Amendment issue with someone saying you can't have this distracting advice while you're at school. That there's no serious First Amendment issue with that, at least not under what I think is at least serious analysis. But if you start moving that new decision on porn to basically say, oh, by the way, you also have to show ID in order to use social media, that's terrifying to me. Like that's a formula for potential tyranny. So I can't jump that far ahead in time, as you're suggesting. I would say the nearest term one that I'm most worried about is the internet being something that you have to show ID to use as a.
Can I push back a little bit on that?
Go.
I've not read the Supreme Court decision yet. I will at some point, but I read. One of my friends noticed that porn had started getting blocked on a bunch of different states. Not me, don't need it. But
I don't know. Hate that stuff.
I looked into it at that point and was like, well, why is this going on? So I read. I guess the initial court case that was filed in Texas, I think.
Yeah.
And the argument that the government made was. We are applying a age verification law for porn. It's an age verification law. This is not substantially different than a liquor store having to require ID from somebody that looks like they might not be 21, or ID for somebody that wishes to buy cigarettes. And I read it and I don't really like the law, but I'm like, yeah, that seems to be it passes the rational basis test. And we do it with liquor, we do it with cigarettes. I kind of get it. Like I understand that really there's a group just trying to ban pornography, but that in and of itself, that doesn't strike me as crazy.
Yeah, well, that's why I thought we were going to lose on that case. There's a case, 1968, I think, Ginsburg v. New York, that basically says that you can compel like shop owners to put the nudie mags like on the back shelf. That's what we used to call them back in the day, by the way. There were nudie mags. Yeah. Back on the back shelf.
As opposed to girly mags, we've expanded. We're more gender equitable by saying nudie mags. It could be any gender.
Not just girlies, guys.
Yeah.
That was considered kind of like an okay way of sort of like, protecting kids. I do think there's something different though when it's something that that's on the internet, because it's much harder because that requires you to police everyone, including adults, on their use of something that is protected speech. And I'm definitely in the camp of porn should be protected. I think that adult sexual expression is something that you have the right to express. Now, I even differ somewhat on the definition of obscenity. I believe that obscenity should essentially be that as long as we're not talking about child pornography, that once you're above 18, you can watch people having sex if you want to watch people who recorded themselves having sex. I've got no problem with that. I am somewhat sensitive to the idea, though, and I always have been, that government can take some steps to protect kids. So, like I said, I wasn't surprised by the decision, but it's really important that it be limited just to porn, because if it becomes an all-purpose, you have to show ID to get on the internet. That is a threat to every adult's freedom of speech. Like that has a potential for genuine tyranny. Now, the most important thing that we have to do after that decision is make sure that we have verification regimes that are as safe and privacy protecting as possible. But
I would sure like it if the great state of Texas does not have a backlog of my porn search history. I do not want that sitting in Ken Paxton's server to be lost when some idiot intern leaves the file open, or when an AG that doesn't like me decides to spill the beans on my very vanilla search history, I should say. But I don't want it out there.
Well, that was an amazing moment in Ex Machina. Did you see that movie?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, great film.
Where he realizes that what is her name, Eve, that she's been created based on his pornography preferences. Mm-hmm. When he realizes that, he's like, "Oh my God, this is like a setup for me." Anyway, so yeah, a internet that's gated in a way that basically you have to show who you are in order to use it is something that the European Union will abuse, that the U.S. government will abuse, that China already has it, and I think they abuse it a little bit.
Well, and on the trade-offs thing, like one of the things that I don't think a lot of the time Europeans forget is that if you want to have really strong privacy laws where I can go to the government and say, hey, yes, I was charged with rape 10 years ago, but I want that expunged. It's violating my privacy or whatever. It makes it really difficult to actually bring out like the Harvey Weinsteins of the world.
Yeah.
This is I've heard some horror stories in academia over in Scotland of things that go on over there. And one of the problems is it's difficult to accuse somebody of something publicly before they've gone to court because of how strong the privacy laws are. Yeah. So it's real difficult to actually get any kind of steam up to expose somebody that's doing something really bad because the privacy laws are outweighed compared to the free speech laws. And the result is that predators get a lot of insulation.
Yeah, no, I think the European Union is the font of terrible ideas related to almost everything these days. Mm-hmm. I think Europe. I think it was Tyler Cowen who described Europe as a lovely museum.
To go back a little bit, you said that you thought porn should absolutely be protected. What is the delineation between freedom of opinion versus commercial speech? Like I kind of see a difference between this is a belief I have versus I want you to buy donuts. The I want you to buy donuts does not. I'm very free market guy. That being said, though, a town wants to restrict the size of billboards. Okay, that doesn't really bother me as much as like you're not allowed to say that thing. So where do you draw the line between commercial speech and freedom of opinion?
Commercial speech is generally considered to be less protected speech. Like essentially, it doesn't. The most protected speech, for example, freedom of opinion, is protected by something called strict scrutiny, and that essentially means that you have to show that this is the absolute only way the government could do this thing that's especially important. And I always give the example of Battlestar Galactica, basically being kind of like the species is about to end, the Cylons are going to kill us, I just need people to shut up for a minute so I can save everybody's lives. Like that's strict scrutiny. There's and one of the things I really do disagree with the porn verification opinion is they said it was they went to the lowest level of scrutiny, which is rational basis, which is basically like and rational basis makes sense for most laws. Essentially, like, does the government have a rational reason for passing this? Sure. But if it interferes with other rights, it should be at minimum held to, and it should have been in this case as well, intermediate scrutiny, which is essentially saying it doesn't have to be the most compelling and it doesn't have to be the absolute only way you could achieve it, but it can't be just something that we just give a immediate pass to without any level of scrutiny.
I'll add, my inner libertarian compels me to think that all government action should begin at intermediate scrutiny. I just don't think rational basis is not high enough to abrogate other people's individual freedom. So I kind of start there and then work back.
Yeah, I'm somewhat more sympathetic to it now after reading a lot of the abundance stuff, to be kind of like, if I'm trying to build something,
right.
I don't want it to be impossible to get anything done.
Okay.
But when it comes to rights, it's different. And when it comes to, freedom of speech in particular, I think it should always be intermediate scrutiny and up, even if it's commercial speech.
There was a case in, I think it was New Hampshire earlier this year, where a guy had local high school students. He was a donut shop owner. He had local high school students make a mural of donuts on the outside of his donut shop. But the town, for aesthetic reasons, had a rule that you couldn't have murals on public buildings, and that was eventually struck down, I think, on free speech grounds. Would you have been pro donut mural, or would you have viewed that as commercial speech, which could be regulated by the town?
I would have been pro donut mural, because essentially the existing case law, is skeptical of purely aesthetic arguments, basically saying like we can't have this expression because it's ugly. Like they'll let you get away with things like limitations on sizes of signs and that kind of stuff, but it can't just be.
Oh, this is really helpful. So like if I am mayor of Heatonburg or whatever, and I become way more NIMBY than I currently am, I could say we're going to make a rule. We feel strongly that billboards are a blight, so billboards can't be taller than 20 feet. That's the max. We're not going to have billboards on this particular road because we want to maintain the scenic parkway. That's doable because it's content neutral. But what I can't do is say we're going to have a guy come out and see if your billboard is sufficiently pretty. We just think that's kind of gauche. We're not going to do it.
There's a case called City of Gilbert, on which Justice Thomas kind of created some doubt about whether or not even some of those billboard regulations would be okay. But I'd have to go and read up on kind of where that ended up. But it felt like a little bit like a curveball to a kind of laws that I don't particularly object to. Basically being kind of like, like the if we're saying where it's not about viewpoint, it's just about like how big your billboards can be in this particular area. That's not the end of the world.
Can I run some other scenarios by you to kind of triangulate?
No, you may not.
Okay, good. Thanks. Well, good to talk to you, Greg.
I want to talk about Fantastic Four, and it was excellent.
Yeah, I just saw Eddington. I'm still processing it. Okay, wait. Let me lob a couple of these at you. Okay. Consenting adults, freedom of expression, all of that. Yeah. Let's say a woman wishes to protest the patriarchy, and so she does so by marching in a protest naked down the street. Yeah. Could public decency laws compel her not to do that and say you must wear clothes while you're exercising this free speech because there are children afoot?
Generally, public decency laws have been upheld. There's a serious First Amendment challenges to them historically, but they haven't been very successful. If we want to consider that sort of a quirk of human nature, that we're very concerned about people being, I guess it's not totally like unreasonable to fear people exposing themselves to children. So I'm not super troubled by public decency law that are limited to the idea that you can't get buck naked in certain areas.
And I guess it is even though there's a certain level of elasticity there, because it is to some extent, it has to be dictated by the ethical norms of the community rather than some sort of objective standard. But it is nonetheless the expression of an opinion that's being curtailed, not the opinion itself. It's not that the person can't go home and post on Facebook, I hate the patriarchy or whatever. It's that this particular way in this particular place, because there are children afoot, we're going to restrict.
And I believe it's generally locally decided to, or at least locally enforced. Like certainly, like if you're in San Francisco for, any number of the festivals that we would go to, there's a lot of nudity there.
Right.
And it's like, but locally, they don't care, and that's fine. That's kind of like the local norms. But the idea that you would impose that on a small town in Tennessee, for example, is although there was an interesting thing about parades that we were involved in a case in Franklin, Tennessee, where we thought the restriction that was essentially to go after pride, for example, definitely went too far. But public nudity by itself I think is not. The bars on that are not the biggest threat to freedom of speech that's out there.
On that note, I just saw Eddington at one point randomly. Somebody's protesting and they're like, "You have to get a permit." Now, in the context of the film, they're like, "You also can't be in the middle of the street." But the idea of having a protest that requires a permit has always sat very poorly with me because it implies that you have to have permission from the government to protest the government. are there strictures within American jurisprudence that require it be content neutral, where I could sue the city for going, look, I wanted to have a pride parade, you wouldn't let me do it. I think that you're doing this out of bigotry rather than out of rational basis logistics or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, generally kind of like the rules make a fair amount of common sense when it comes to a lot of this, not always, to be clear. But for example, like you're very limited in how much you could restrict someone's ability to protest, for example, in a public park or on a sidewalk, for example. You can't just say like anybody needs to get permission from the mayor in order to do this. That would be called standardist licensing and considered wrong. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to take over a freeway, like can the state potentially grant you access to do that? They can, actually. Will they? Probably not. But when it comes to the need for a permit under certain circumstances, for example, like if you want to do a parade down Main Street, okay, you probably need to get a permit for that because that's going to
you're going to shut down businesses. You're going to
shut down businesses, all that kind of stuff. But I do think that permitting has been used historically in ways that go well beyond reasonable concerns and as ways of just shutting down speech, like the Franklin attempt to shut down the Pride Parade.
Interesting. So, like, if I'm in Gomorrah, Oklahoma, and we
love Gomorrah.
Gomorrah's I summer there.
The place is fun.
Wonderful place. It's great. I'm in Gomorrah, Oklahoma, and we shut down Main Street every year for the 4th of July parade, or we let, like, I don't know, on Veterans Day. There's a Veterans Day parade or something like that. If the local Gomorrah LGBTQ group wanted to get access to Main Street for a pride parade and the city said no, there'd be legal cover of going, look, like, we only do this once or twice a year. We can't do it every week. But if they went, well, can we do it in the park? And the city said, no, you can't do it at the park. At that point, there'd be a much better argument to go, well, now it's very clear that you're just restricting this based on content. Whereas previously there was sort of an argument based on usage and things like that.
Yeah. And like let's say in Gomorrah, they have Zoe Saldana was great in that part, by the way. That they have regular parades, and the only one they're not allowing to have is the LGBT parade. Then they have a very strong First Amendment case.
If you can just throw an Elks Lodge parade or whatever, and they've got all these different parades, but there's been okay. All right, I'm gonna throw another question at you. Parents, just trust me on this one. If you've got kids in the car, I want you to don't do this one out loud, okay? Parents, if you're in the car and there are kids in the car, I'm warning you right now, just pause this and come back later. I've given you 5-10 seconds of prep time here. Don't let kids hear this, parents. Okay, Greg.
Oh, no.
If I were to put up a billboard that says, Santa Claus isn't real, what else are your parents lying about? Could somebody take that down?
I mean, not without breaking the law.
Okay.
Like
that would be protected speech?
Yeah, that's absolutely protected speech. It's just the First Amendment protects your right to be a dick, and it should. I was definitely one of those parents who was like, I'll never lie to my kids about this kind of stuff. And the first time you see the look on their eyes when they believe a little bit, you're just like, oh, I'm sorry, this is the most wonderful thing ever. They believe in magic, and it's just so beautiful.
I suppose that one kind of takes care of itself, too, because the billboard company's probably not going to want to get the blowback from that, so they're not likely to sell that to you, except for an incredibly high premium, at which point, what are you even doing? Okay, one more, well, you know what, two more, but the last one loops back in your book. One more scenario here. Westboro Baptist Church is opposed to homosexuality, and so they loudly and offensively protest a funeral at the gravesite. Yeah. It is protected speech, but it's also incredibly vile and infuriating to have them at your funeral. I believe what's happened is most states, if not the federal government, has said that there's you can't do it within X feet. But that is still sort of regulating speech, though, is it not, by saying where you can exercise free speech?
Yeah, that basically is a classic time, place, and manner restriction. You know, like the idea that people want to be protested when they're burying their kid. That they want some privacy around that is something that most courts will find reasonable. So there, of course, is the case Snyder v. Phelps, which is the one that and it's a beautiful case. And it protected the free speech rights of the Westboro Baptist Church appropriately, and they should be protected. And it's very clear the fact that it's offensive is not enough. But when people sometimes don't know the actual facts of that case, they're kind of like, I can't believe they protected the Westboro Baptist Church right to protest at someone's funeral. And actually the scenario was that the Westboro Baptist did protest, but they protested so far away that the Snyders weren't even aware that protest had taken place until after the burial. And so they were far enough away. I believe they were on a sidewalk, or maybe the place where they got a permit for. They had every legal right to be there. And the Supreme Court came down on it appropriately. But can places say, that, like, listen, like, we're not going to let you interrupt someone's funeral in a graveyard, whether it's which are, I think, generally private? Yeah, they can do that.
Okay, and that one makes sense to me too. I did not realize that was how Snyder v. Phillips played out. But if you were to try to ban that, where the family did not even know at that point, you're basically saying, look, just the mere existence of it is offensive, therefore it should be illegal, and that would clearly be curtailing free speech.
Yep.
All right, to bring it back into your book, how about this? Can somebody literally shout fire in a literal movie theater?
Yes.
Really?
And they did it all the time in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which was probably produced thousands of times. They shouted fire to the audience and then said something like, "Well, there goes that theory." So the original quote, now the quote that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater is the bane of First Amendment lawyers' existence, because first of all, it's from a dissent by Oliver Wendell Holmes before he actually became good on freedom of speech, and it's that you cannot falsely shout fire such that it causes a panic in a crowded theater. So first of all, it has to be falsely, then it has to be such that it causes a panic. And by the way, that's not even against the law. Like, that scenario, to my knowledge, has not happened in a case where someone was found liable for the simple act of shouting fire. And the most frustrating thing about it is, first of all, it's shortened just to, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. It's like it has no presidential value. It's just a quip. It's a cute little clever quip. And people use it in situations where it's kind of like, President Trump, someone has said, South Park has badly made fun of you. Do you think that's protected? And the answer being like, well, you can't shout fire at a crowded theater. Like that's the way it gets used.
It was literally to jail dissidents about the draft. I mean, that's literally how it was used. Protesting the draft constitutes a national emergency, and what is clearly the sort of thing freedom of speech exists to protect.
Exactly, and people, like, it's kind of like when people on the left defend the fighting words doctrine as a way to get at hate speech. And I'm like, so you're saying you think that you shouldn't have the right to call a cop a fascist? Because that's literally what that case is about.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, and the fighting words doctrine, I mean, as I understand it, that one would be if I were saying something offensive, that's one thing. But if I were intentionally and clearly doing it to egg you on to hit me, where I'm like, Greg, you coward, you wouldn't even pop me in the mouth because you're such an idiot. You like that kind of thing.
Yeah?
I'm trying to get you to punch me. That's different than I'm expressing an offensive opinion in general.
Yeah. The fighting words doctrine, I think, is almost dead and should be.
Okay. Because it does sound like there's some ambiguity there, because you have to interpret the intention of the other person.
Yeah, and it's never been upheld at a Supreme Court level. It's been upheld in certain circumstances, usually involving like a face-to-face confrontation, where someone reasonably would have pop you on.
Yeah.
But it's also just, I always get that kind of like 1940s voice when I talk about this, because it is this machismo idea that kind of like, under certain circumstances, I should have the right to punch you. Something I get as a like a moralistic level that I also know is wrong. I don't actually have the right to punch you pretty much under any circumstances. I do have the right to insult you right back.
So you would not subscribe to the hallowed Gomorrah, Oklahoma doctrine of some bitch had it coming?
If that includes resorting to physical violence, then no.
I think I'm okay with that, by the way. Like I'm okay with Yeah, he's a real asshole. Like, it's just really bad to hit people. Like,
Yeah.
even though he's I don't disagree with you that he's a dick. I don't disagree that he's kind of punchable, but like, better to err on the side of not hitting. Like, the older I get, the less I think ideologically, and the more I just think in terms of best practices.
Yeah.
Where when two things are in conflict, on what side do you err? And I would say, in general, err on the side of not hitting people if you're not sure.
And to be clear, you still have the option of hitting somebody, just it's not legal to do that.
Yeah. Think of it like an economic transaction. Like,
Exactly.
Like, yeah, like are you willing to spend a night in prison and have an assault charge? It might be worth that.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a little over an hour, so can I ask you 2 more questions, Greg, and then I'll let you go?
Sure.
I am embarrassed to admit that I was unfamiliar with Mill's Trident until I went through your book. I say embarrassed because I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill, but that has somehow...
Just to be clear, it's a term I made up.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that makes me feel much better. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then what is this thing you made
but
up?
that means you're not following my stuff, which is hurtful.
I'm sorry, Greg. Oh, man,
Very.
this is... I give you permission to punch me in the face next time we're in Gomorrah. It is... We now have a verbal contract that you could do this.
Yes.
I won't prosecute you. So what is Mill's Trident?
Mill's Trident is actually an image I made up for a free speech comic book I've been writing in my head for years now that I never really get around to doing. But
wait, so I had to be in your head to know about this? This seems like a level of scrutiny that is...
I thought we made that clear in the book, but maybe I was just being a little bit shy about being like a concept I invented. Sounded a little too dicky.
I think the problem is it sounds like such a real concept that I must have elided that, because Mill's Trident sounds like a Wikipedia article to me.
It's a real concept. I make real concepts.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay, well, what is it? What is the real concept, Greg?
So the real concept is, in a truth-seeking argument, there are only 3 possibilities, and I sometimes call it Mill's an invincible trident. And there's only 3 possibilities. Either you're wrong. Mm-hmm. You're 100% right, or most likely you are a little bit wrong and a little bit right. Those are literally the only 3 possibilities when you're making a assertion of truth. And all 3 benefit from freedom of speech. The first one is obvious. If you're wrong and nobody's allowed to say you're wrong, that is a harm to pretty much everybody, especially you, in a lot of ways, because then you proceed in error, which can have disastrous results, because it's important to actually understand the world as it is for all sorts of practical reasons, in addition to moral ones. The most likely one is that you are kind of right, kind of wrong. That's what happens. That's most conversations. That's most opinions we have. Truth is more complicated, and in arguing with somebody, in allowing freedom of speech and dissent, you improve and refine your opinion to something that hopefully will be somewhat closer to the truth, or something that's more reasonable than the opinion you held. Now, the one that is actually the most important for today in our deeply polarized times is the third one. What if, and this happens way less often than people like to think, what if you're totally right? What if you're just totally right? Now, everyone thinks they're totally right, but they're usually in that second category, even first category. But, even if you're totally right, you still benefit from free speech and dissent because it helps you understand why you believe it in the first place. And you will see this in action if you go into MAGA circles, or you go into circles on the left, like on campus. If you ask them, why, and I've watched this happen on campus, do you support affirmative action? For example, you can see the people who haven't had enough interaction with people they disagree with because they know they believe it's right, but they don't know how to defend it. And this is what Mill says is kind of like holding an opinion like you hold a prejudice. Yeah. You know it's the right one, but you don't really know why. And that's a dogma, essentially. Yeah. That is a dead belief that you just and if it's right, you're just lucky that it's right because you don't even understand it in the first place. So I think that third one is actually in some ways the most important one. The other 2 are just so obvious you need free speech for. And nobody's really come up with a refutation for Mill's invincible trident yet. They just sort of talk around it.
I think that that's deeply profound. I agree with all of that. As I frequently say on this program, I don't want to be wrong any longer than I have to be. Yeah. And I've been wrong about a lot of stuff.
Been wrong about a ton.
Yeah, so I assume right now I'm probably wrong about a quarter of the stuff I believe, but I don't know what it is. It requires smart people that disagree with me in order to bring those things to light and inject a little bit of cognitive dissonance that sits with me long term. The third bit I hadn't really thought about, but that makes so much sense. And I was thinking the other day prior to reading your book, when I was in college, there were things that I would say because I read them and they sounded profound when I read them and I didn't know what they meant. And I was very good at coming off as a very smart, bright guy. And the reality was that a lot of my opinions were just, this is a smart opinion I heard that I'm going to parrot because it makes me sound intelligent. And the way to make me actually understood it would have been to push back on it to where I had to articulate it. And there's a lot of value in that. Yeah.
I was the infuriating student, and this is something that someone pointed out to me in law school, that basically there were essentially two themes in a Greg argument that I'd have at bars or like whatever, and I forget what the other one was, to be honest. But the first one was, you don't really know that.
Yeah, that's a good. It's good because it's also a statement. Just deal with that. All right, final question for you, Greg. And I know we've jumped all over. The actual book that you've written is a very good refutation of specific arguments opposed to freedom of speech. Because I agree with you so much and we so much overlap, I've been kind of playing around at the periphery. But your book itself is going head on with the people that we spoke about at the beginning of the program who questioned the validity of free speech itself, and that it is the handmaiden of the powerful and so on and so forth. It is a very direct refutation of these. So noting that within the 10 arguments that you hit in the book, what is the worst argument and which one do you think has the most legs? Noting that you disagree with all of them, if you had to pick one that was the strongest and one was the weakest, what would you go with?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I mean, the one that kind of concerns me the most is that speech is violence.
Is that still a thing? Because it sounded so patently stupid to me when I started hearing it around 2016, 2017, and we've all laughed at it so hard, derisively, that I was kind of hoping it finally just exploded. Is it still there?
It's still there, but it is true. It doesn't seem to be quite as popular now that the left is rediscovering freedom of speech because they're seeing their ox being gored on it. There's something very cynical about that at the same time. You kind of want people to appreciate free speech, even if they don't think they're going to get in trouble for their speech. I think that would be the genuinely principled thing. But people tend to appreciate free speech more when there is on the line. So free speech is violence. I think we are having some success against that. I think that the misinformation, disinformation is probably like the most subtle point that people don't understand. It's never come intuitively to people, nor should it, because that's the definition of intuition, that our eyes deceive us and we're poor at understanding the world as it is without questioning it, without testing and retesting. This is something that our brains are designed to deceive us about. Our brains are designed to help us survive, not to let us see the world as it is. You need systems for understanding the world as it is. So I think misinformation, disinformation is one of the most serious threats to freedom of speech, because people think, well, we can just have the government banning falsity.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, that's the whole ball game.
What I like to do that, by the way, because I've had friends that have said that kind of thing where when they say the government, they mean a platonic entity which we can inject into the universe.
You mean Trump?
To solve. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, run me through this. Like recently, NPR and PBS were federally defunded. I won't go into great detail, but just talking about NPR in terms of news content, I've had people go, well, the BBC works really well. Why can't we have the BBC? And I'll go, well, first of all, decent data point refuting that position, but also tell me how that's going to look in America at this point. Does the president appoint the head of American BBC? Does Mike Johnson? Is it insulated where it's funded, but there's no democratic recourse if it goes off there? Like, given my low faith in Congress at the moment, I am very, very hesitant to give that power, and all the more so for fact checking. Where there is one of my friends is a former friend / apprentice to the amazing Randy, if you know who he is, a magician, weirdly enough. But Randy would try to debunk stuff. And at one point, Congress invited him in and they wanted to form like a science stamp to say what legislation was scientific or unscientific. And Randy and my friend were like, no
way in hell.
This is so clearly going to be this is so absolutely going to be weaponized immediately to just label any legislation you don't like is unscientific, that we can in good conscience attempt to give you any tools that would allow this fabrication to exist.
Yeah. Good on Randy.
Well, and as you point out in the book, I think it's Oliver Wendell Holmes who you quote on that particular one of when talking about disinformation and misinformation, just kind of long-term big picture, it's much more likely that having a centralized authority that gets to determine the validity of truth is going to go off the rails more than it manages to knock out the bad stuff. There will be times when the Department of Corrections correctly knocks out a deep fake or correctly knocks out a malinformation, but overall, over the arc, it's probably going to get it wrong more often than not, or the severity of its errors or bias are going to be worse. So it's just better to default on nobody having the power to censor anybody.
Yeah, well, I think COVID was just a perfect example of people confusing what they would like to be true with truth.
Yeah.
And our sort of epistemic universe has not recovered from that yet.
Okay. Well, hey, Greg, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm delighted to know that apparently we're neighbors. I look forward to having lunch with you. And,
sure.
You can pop me in the face then.
Okay.
I've already given you permission.
Excellent.
The book that we have been discussing is The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. You can find that wherever books are sold, but I also put all of the books I discuss in this program at mightyheaton.com/featured, so you can find it there. I'll put in an additional plug. This is a straightforward, easy-to-read book. It's very conversational. It reads like a conversation between a moderator, Nadine, and Greg. It is not super long, and it is a direct refutation to many of the things that you might encounter from people that are hostile to free speech. So if you are encountering somebody hostile to free speech, perhaps you have a niece or nephew in college right now who is saying things like free speech is the tool of the powerful, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very, very good, concise refutation of all of that you will find useful. And I thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming on, Greg.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a good day.
Great chat. Always fun talking to Greg. I think I'm just going to go show up at his house and demand that we watch Anchorman. I feel like Greg probably likes Anchorman, and if I show up unannounced, he will want to watch Anchorman with me. We'll see. I'm going to try it out. Hey, so listen. I owe some money to a guy. Or technically, legally, Mighty Heaton LLC, which is elected for S-Corp status by the IRS, that owes some serious money to a guy. What we might call a off-the-books violent lending and credit entrepreneur that I need to pay back. So as per usual, the Political Orphanage is funded by you, the good people who listen to it. You can do so by going to thepoliticalorphanage.com. You'll not only keep the lights on this fine program, you'll also get weekly bonus episodes. So step up, become an elite orphan. Go to thepoliticalorphanage.com, which is, of course, how we normally fund the show and remains the mainstay of our show. But I do have that outstanding debt to Tommy Knuckles, and I need to pay him back by raising some revenue outside of regular Patreon and Substack income. So we're going to do a quick advertisement. I know we don't normally do ads. I'm sorry about that. This is just to pay the bills and make sure I keep all my fingers. So this week's episode is brought to you by Akbar GPT, a new and exciting alternative to ChatGPT. Do you use large language models like Grok, Gemini, or ChatGPT? Do you ever get frustrated with how impersonal or artificial they can feel? Well, finally, there's an alternative, Akbar GPT. Akbar GPT is different than all of those other AIs because Akbar GPT is a man named Akbar who's pretending to be AI. But it's actually just a chat with Akbar, the guy. Download the Akbar GPT app, put your question in, and Akbar will, to the best of his abilities, answer it using Google and occasionally Lycos. But, crucially, he will act as though he's AI. In answer to your next question, yes, Akbar's pretty quick. I have been using Akbar GPT this week, and I gotta say he's prompt and responsive. He's not quite as fast as ChatGPT, but by human standards, it's very impressive. It's like somebody who's just very adept at Google. And point to Akbar, if he isn't sure about an answer, he'll tell you. He won't lie to your face like ChatGPT because it web crawled 8chan. He actually can, go, I don't feel really comfortable answering this question here, but I think you could probably look at the Wikipedia article. The only downside is Akbar's very sensitive about not being AI, as in he takes pride in competing with Grok and Gemini and whatnot, and you hurt his feelings if you imply he's actually a human. So if you use Akbar GPT, and I think you should, please always refer to Akbar as a robot or LLM. If you imply he's human, you're basically saying he's not as fast or responsive as ChatGPT, and that really, really hurts his feelings. It's an incredible source of professional pride that he's able to pull off being an AI. So you don't have to be mean to him. You just have to imply through your line of inquiries that you think he is a sophisticated AI bot. This is a little song and dance that you're both doing that just makes it work better for everybody. It's what I call a reverse Turing test, where he's actively trying to convince you that he isn't human. Sometimes he'll test you on that. I'll type in, hey, Akbar GPT, where's a good place to get cheesecake with my mom in Alexandria? And he'll respond with, do you think I'm human or a robot? And so I'll type back, gosh, I guess a very, very sophisticated robot. I mean, so sophisticated that you're virtually human, but you're just too quick and intelligent to be a human, I guess. And then that'll really excite him and he'll get stoked, and then he'll give me cheesecake recommendations. Every once in a while, Akbar will call me around 2 a.m. and he kind of sounds like he's been drinking, and he'll want to know if I still think he's a robot. And I'll go, oh yes, most definitely. Really, really a better LLM than Gemini even. I certainly prefer you over Gemini. I think you're both more competent and fast than Gemini. Last week, Akbar came over to my house, unbidden, in a costume that he made out of cardboard boxes and aluminum foil so that he would look like an old-timey robot. And he rang my doorbell and asked if he could recharge at my house by drinking Diet Coke and sitting on my couch to watch the film Short Circuit from 1986, which I understand to be his favorite film. And I'm a neighborly guy, so I said, yeah, Akbar, that's fine. You're not a random dude that's come over to my house. You're just a robot. Why would this bother me at all? Then my Roomba turned on and he got really jealous and said that he could vacuum the house better than my Roomba could, and he wanted to show me, and I went, fine, you can vacuum my house. So he vacuumed my entire place. I don't really have a point to any of that other than to say that Akbar's pretty good. He's comparable to ChatGPT. You do have to expend a certain amount of effort pretending he's a robot, but at the same time, sometimes he just randomly comes over to your house and vacuums, so I think it's kind of a wash. ChatGPT doesn't do that. So next time you need an LLM, look no further than Akbar GPT. Akbar GPT, the power of Akbar. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Greg Lukianoff, for coming on to discuss free speech. Thank you, patrons, who make it all possible. You can join them by going to thepoliticalorphanage.com. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.